What happens when voters approve a major political change at the ballot box, and then, less than 24 hours later, a judge declares those votes ineffective? That is exactly what just happened in Virginia. In a dramatic twist with national consequences, Virginia voters narrowly approved a referendum that could redraw the state's congressional map in a way that heavily benefits Democrats. But before the victory could even settle in, a judge in Tazewell County stepped in and blocked the state from certifying the results or putting the new map into effect. Suddenly, one state referendum became a major legal battle, a national political flashpoint, and the latest chapter in America's escalating redistricting war. And this is not just about Virginia, because if these maps eventually survive in court, they could help Democrats flip as many as 4 Republican-held House seats. In a year when control of the U.S. House is one of the biggest prizes in American politics, that makes this story much bigger than a state-level referendum. It becomes a battle over who writes the rules, who controls the map, and ultimately, who controls Congress. So in this video, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why a judge intervened after the vote, what both parties are arguing, why Donald Trump has jumped into the story with fresh election fraud claims, and why this one court fight in Virginia could ripple across U.S. politics far beyond the state's borders. Let's start with the basic facts. On April 21st, Virginia voters went to the polls in a special election referendum on congressional redistricting. The measure passed, but only narrowly, by roughly 3 percentage points. That result was immediately seen as a major victory for Democrats, because the proposed new map would make 10 of Virginia's 11 congressional districts Democratic-leaning. Right now, Virginia's House delegation stands at 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans. So the proposed map would represent a massive shift in partisan advantage. That alone would have made this one of the most important state political stories in the country. But the real shock came the next day. On April 22nd, Tazewell County Circuit Court Judge Jack Hurley issued an order blocking Virginia from certifying the referendum results. He declared that the constitutional amendment behind the referendum was invalid from the beginning, using the legal phrase void ab initio, and said that any votes cast for or against it were ineffective. His ruling also barred state officials from taking any steps to implement the new map, including updating election districts or voter registration records. So in plain English, Virginia voters said yes, but the judge said, not so fast. And that instantly transformed what looked like a Democratic breakthrough into a full-blown legal and constitutional crisis, at least within the state's election system. Now, if you're outside Virginia, you might be wondering, why should anyone care this much about one state's map fight? Because this is not just a Virginia story. It is part of a nationwide redistricting arms race. Across the country, both parties have been looking for ways to redraw congressional districts ahead of the 2026 midterms. The broader backdrop, according to multiple reports, is that Republicans in states like Texas, Missouri, North Carolina, and potentially Florida pursued or planned redistricting changes that could strengthen their House position. Democrats, in turn, have increasingly responded by using the tools available in blue or competitive states to push back. Virginia became one of the biggest tests of that strategy. And that's why the stakes are so high. If Virginia's new map eventually takes effect, Democrats could gain up to 4 seats in the House from this state alone. In a tightly divided chamber, that is enormous. One state could meaningfully shift the odds of which party controls the House after the midterms. That's why national Democratic figures celebrated the referendum result as bigger than Virginia, and why Republicans fought so aggressively in court to stop it. CNBC described the Virginia referendum as the latest battleground in the partisan gerrymandering war leading into November's midterm elections. CBS similarly framed it as part of a nationwide redistricting battle, noting that legal challenges have followed nearly every major state-by-state effort. So Virginia is not isolated. It's a frontline state in a much larger national contest over congressional power. So why exactly did Judge Hurley block the referendum after voters had already approved it? The core Republican argument was not simply that they disliked the political outcome. Their legal case focused on whether the referendum itself was constitutional under Virginia law. According to reporting from CBS, Pilot, 29 News, and Reuters, the judge found multiple problems. He said lawmakers did not follow the proper constitutional process required to place the amendment on the ballot. He also criticized the ballot language itself, calling it flagrantly misleading. And he argued the process may have violated notice requirements, including a 90-day public notice issue. In short, the court's ruling says the measure was legally defective before voters ever touched a ballot. One of the biggest legal disputes centers on Virginia's amendment process. For a constitutional amendment to pass in Virginia, the General Assembly must approve it twice, with a House of Delegates election in between. Democrats argued they satisfied that requirement by first approving the measure in late 2025, then going through a House election in November, and then approving it again in early 2026. Republicans argued the first step was invalid because it happened after early voting had already begun in the 2025 election, meaning the process did not comply with the state constitution in the way required. That may sound technical, and it is, but technical legal arguments often decide political battles in the United States. Because once you move a fight from campaign slogans into constitutional procedure, the question changes. It's no longer just, did voters support this? It becomes, was this vote legally authorized in the first place? And that is the battlefield Republicans chose. Republicans have been clear in how they want the public to view this story. Their argument is that Democrats attempted to manipulate the redistricting system in order to engineer a favorable map under the cover of a voter referendum. The Republican National Committee celebrated the ruling as a major victory for Virginians and called the redistricting push a blatant power grab. Republicans also argued that the referendum language was misleading and that the process undermined Virginia's bipartisan redistricting system, which had been set up in a previous reform effort to reduce partisan mapmaking. This is important because Republicans are not just making a legal case. They are making a legitimacy case. They want to frame this not as a fight against democracy, but as a defense of constitutional procedure and fair process. In their version of events, the problem is not that people voted. The problem is that voters were presented with a flawed or misleading referendum that should never have been on the ballot in the first place. And politically, that framing matters. Because simply arguing, we lost the vote, but we want a do-over looks weak. Arguing, the entire referendum was unconstitutional from the start, is a far stronger position in court and in public messaging. That is exactly why the lawsuit focused so heavily on procedural defects, legislative timing, and ballot wording. Democrats, of course, see this very differently. Their argument is simple. Virginia voters spoke, and a single judge should not be able to nullify that democratic decision after the fact. Attorney General Jay Jones responded immediately, saying his office would appeal. He argued that Virginia voters have spoken and that an activist judge should not have veto power over the people's vote. Democratic allies and pro-referendum groups went even further, framing the ruling as an attempt by Republicans to overturn a result they could not stop at the ballot box. Democrats also stressed something else. Unlike some redistricting efforts in other states, this one actually went before voters. That point has become central to the Democratic defense. Hakeem Jeffries argued that Democrats responded to the national redistricting war in a manner consistent with our values, saying their approach was temporary, forceful, and approved by the voters. Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger similarly framed the referendum as Virginians pushing back at the ballot box rather than allowing politicians elsewhere to reshape congressional power without voter input. That is a powerful political message, because it flips the usual gerrymandering debate on its head. For years, Democrats often positioned themselves as opponents of partisan gerrymandering and supporters of independent commissions. But once Republicans began aggressively pursuing mid-cycle map changes in other states, Democrats increasingly argued that unilateral disarmament was no longer realistic. In other words, if one side is redrawing maps for advantage, the other side cannot afford to sit still. Virginia became a test case for that new doctrine. And then Donald Trump did what Donald Trump often does in moments like this. He turned the story into a broader fight over election legitimacy. According to Reuters, Trump claimed without evidence that the Virginia redistricting vote had been rigged. He blamed mail-in ballots for the outcome and portrayed ordinary vote counting as suspicious, even though no evidence of fraud was presented. Reuters explicitly connected these claims to Trump's long-running pattern of casting doubt on election outcomes he dislikes, especially after his 2020 defeat. CNBC also reported that Trump complained about the wording of the referendum, claiming it was confusing and suggesting even he could not understand it. That overlaps in part with the legal challenge over ballot language, but it also served a broader political purpose: to delegitimize the result in the eyes of his supporters. This is where the story becomes bigger than redistricting, because now the battle is happening on two levels at once. In court, the question is constitutional procedure. In politics, the question becomes whether an unfavorable result should be trusted at all. And once those two fights overlap, the story starts touching raw nerves in American democracy: courts, elections, voter trust, and the legitimacy of institutions. Part of what makes this story so explosive is the sequence. If the judge had blocked the referendum weeks before the vote, this would still be controversial, but easier for the public to process. Courts stop ballots all the time over eligibility or procedural issues. But here, the vote happened first. The people voted. A result was declared. Then the judge stepped in and said the whole exercise was legally ineffective. That sequence creates a powerful sense of democratic whiplash. It makes supporters feel as though their votes were erased after the fact, while opponents feel the court simply corrected an unconstitutional process that should never have gone forward. Both sides now believe they are defending democracy. That is why this fight is so emotionally and politically charged. And timing matters for another reason. Virginia's congressional primaries are approaching in the coming months, and legal uncertainty over district lines can become a logistical nightmare. Candidates need to know where to run. Parties need to know how to organize, election officials need to know how to administer districts, and voters need clarity. The longer this drags on, the more chaotic the 2026 election setup could become. 29 News noted that the Virginia Supreme Court is likely to move quickly ahead of August congressional primaries, precisely because delay has real operational consequences. So what happens now? The immediate next step is appeal. Attorney General Jay Jones said his office would file an appeal right away, and multiple reports suggest the fight is likely to move rapidly through the appellate process and ultimately back toward the Supreme Court of Virginia. That court had already allowed the referendum to proceed, but it did not decide the full constitutional merits beforehand. Now it may be forced to do exactly that. There are basically three broad scenarios. 1. Higher courts uphold Hurley's ruling. If that happens, the referendum result is effectively dead, the new map never takes effect, and Virginia keeps operating under its existing arrangement. 2. Higher courts reverse Hurley and allow certification. In that case, the new Democratic favoring map could still be implemented in time for the 2026 cycle. 3. The court splits the difference in some narrower way, perhaps criticizing parts of the process while still trying to preserve the voter outcome. Though based on current reporting, the stark language of the lower court ruling makes a clean compromise look difficult. The most important thing to understand is this: the fight is not over, and the ruling is not the final word. Even the outlets most critical of the ruling note that this is a pause, not necessarily a final defeat for the referendum. But it is a serious pause, one that freezes the entire process until higher courts decide whether the vote can be given legal effect. So where does this leave us? Virginia voters approved a referendum that could dramatically reshape the state's congressional map and alter the battle for the U.S. House. But a judge has now blocked certification, called the votes ineffective, and thrown the whole process into legal limbo. Democrats say the will of the voters is under attack. Republicans say the referendum itself was unconstitutional from the start. Trump is already calling the result rigged without evidence. And the Virginia Supreme Court may soon decide whether this referendum becomes law, history, or just another symbol of America's never-ending electoral trench warfare. And that is why this story matters far beyond Virginia. Because whether you view this as judicial overreach, constitutional correction, or just raw partisan combat, it shows how much of modern democracy now depends not just on votes, but on who gets to interpret, challenge, freeze, certify, or erase them afterward.